The deep winter of 1887 had locked the Montana Territory in ice. Snow fell in thick, silent banks, burying the frozen plains under a blanket of white. For Elias Granger, it was just another day of wrestling with the cold. At 32, he was a man weathered by solitude and harsh seasons. Pipes had burst in the bitter chill again, and he'd spent the daylight hours mending them, his fingers stiff and his breath pluming in the air. As dusk bled into the gray landscape, he returned to his isolated log cabin, a plume of wood smoke still drifting from the chimney. He stamped the snow from his boots, shouldered the door open, and carried his heavy oil lamp inside. He froze on the threshold. A delicate, wavering line of footprints marred the floorboards, leading from the door to his hearth and back again. He stiffened, his hand instinctively going to the rifle on the wall rack. Before he could lift it, a faint movement in the shadows of his simple kitchen caught his eye. He set down the lamp, its light casting long, dancing shadows. "Hello?" he called out, his voice low and rough. "Who's there?" A voice, soft and trembling, answered from the dim glow of the stove. "I'm sorry. I thought this place was abandoned." A pause, then a whisper against the encroaching dark. "I have nowhere else to go." Elias's hand fell away from the rifle. He saw her then, a young woman standing amidst the disarray of his Spartan life, a specter of the storm itself. The hem of her dress was caked with frozen mud, and her breath curled in the lamplight. Damp strands of hair framed a face pale with cold, and ice clung like jewels to her cheeks. Her eyes, wide and fearful, darted from the rifle to the door behind her. This was Annabeth Moore, 24 years old. She was a mail-order bride who had traveled 30 miles to a town where no one had come to meet her. Lost in a drifting blizzard, she had followed the faint glow of Elias's cabin, a pinprick of hope on the horizon. She had knocked once and then pushed open the unlocked door, praying for shelter from either the living or the dead. Elias stood silent, the wind rattling the shutters like a restless spirit. Something shifted within him, an old, forgotten instinct to protect. He slowly lowered the rifle. At the sight, Annabeth's shoulders sagged with a relief so profound it was almost a collapse. He moved with a deliberation he hadn't felt in years. He took a heavy wool blanket from a cupboard and draped it over her trembling shoulders. He knelt and stoked the embers in the stove, the blaze hissing back to life. As he set a kettle on to heat, she wrapped her arms tightly around the blanket. A faint nod, her only response. "You can stay the night," he said quietly. "Just until the storm passes." She looked up, her lips trembling, and nodded again. No words came. He moved around the small space, placing a chipped enamel cup of hot tea on the table and gesturing toward a stool. She sat without hesitation, her cold hands pressed against the warm metal. He watched her as she sipped, her fingers trembling. Her eyes were the color of winter smoke, haunted and weary, as if they had seen too few kind faces. In them, he felt a strange pull, a thread connecting him to something he had not allowed himself to seek since his wife had died 2 winters past. The storm raged outside, but inside the small cabin, the world had narrowed to the crackle of the fire and the quiet breathing of a stranger. Elias watched her stir a simple meal of mush and salted pork, her movements steady despite her exhaustion. He saw in her a need for purpose, a solace that silence alone could not offer. Later, as the night deepened, he found her asleep on a low bench near the hearth, wrapped in the blanket. The clock on the mantel had stopped months ago, but in the flickering firelight, Time seemed to stir again. "Thank you," she murmured, her voice faint with sleep. "You didn't send me away." He offered only a small nod in the darkness. But in that simple gesture, he accepted something both fragile and precious. Outside, the wind howled, but within the cabin, two solitary lives had begun a quiet, unexpected turn. Snow fell through the morning like sifted flour. Elias had not slept. He had sat in his chair, watching the steady rise and fall of her breathing. He was not a man used to company, especially not a woman who appeared out of the cold, with nothing but bruised hands and fear in her eyes. At daybreak, he slipped outside to tend to his horse and split wood. When he returned, the kettle was already warm, and Annabeth was quietly scrubbing the tin plates from their supper. Her sleeves were rolled to her elbows, her hair tied back with a scrap of ribbon. "I hope you don't mind," she said, her voice still soft. "I thought it best to earn my keep." Elias merely shrugged, not unkindly. He poured coffee into 2 cups and set one beside her as she found his mending box and began patching one of his old flannel shirts with precise, practiced stitches. He watched her for a moment before asking, his voice gentle, "Who were you going to meet in Bitter Hollow?" Annabeth's hand paused. "I don't know his name," she confessed, her eyes on her work. "The letter came from an agency in Denver. It said a man needed a wife. When I arrived, no one was there. The station clerk just pointed me north." She finally looked up, her expression apologetic. "I suppose I wasn't what he wanted after all." Elias frowned into his cup. "The letter, it said you were a nurse." She nodded. "During the war in Virginia. Afterward, there wasn't much left for anyone. The agency was my last hope." He said nothing for a long while. Outside, the path to town was vanishing beneath fresh drifts. He rose and pulled on his coat. "I was going to take you to the church in town," he said, gesturing toward the snow swallowing the fence posts. "But we're not going anywhere today." The storm did not break for 3 days. The cabin became a world unto itself, filled with the scent of pine smoke and the quiet rhythm of two people learning to share a small space. On the second evening, Annabeth noticed a raw patch of skin on his hand, chapped and split by the cold. Without a word, she knelt beside him and smoothed a balm over it from a small tin in her traveling bag. Later that night, he pushed her chair closer to the hearth when she wasn't looking and poured the last of the tea into her cup, leaving his own empty. The silence between them had grown warmer. On the third day, she spoke of the fiancé she had lost at Gettysburg. From her bag, she pulled a yellowed paper snowflake, its delicate folds a testament to a promise never kept. Elias stared at it, his expression unreadable. "I was there," he said, his voice hoarse. "Left a piece of myself on that field." He rose and went to the mantel, retrieving a weathered photograph of a woman with a soft, lopsided smile. "My wife," he said, his voice thick. "Scarlet fever took her. I buried her on the ridge behind the barn." Annabeth's eyes softened with a shared, unspoken grief. She reached out and gently moved the paper snowflake so it rested beside the photograph. It was not a replacement, but an accompaniment, one sorrow resting beside another. By the fifth morning, the sky broke open, the sun cracking pale and thin above a world scrubbed clean. Elias hitched his mule to a small sled, and they set off for the town of Galloway. The journey was cold and silent, but it was a silence of expectation, not of fear. The town church was a squat, white building with frost-crusted windows. Inside, the pastor, a stout man with a crooked collar, listened to Elias's brief explanation. He thumbed through a heavy ledger. "Annabeth Moore," he muttered. "No record, no husband signed for her. She's not legally spoken for." From a nearby pew, a woman whispered, just loud enough to be heard, "She's one of the rejects. Came all this way for nothing." Annabeth's breath hitched. She turned and fled the stifling warmth of the church, stepping back into the biting cold. Elias followed her out onto the porch. The snow had begun to fall again, soft and hushed. "I'm not who you think I am," she whispered, her arms wrapped around herself. "I know exactly who you are," Elias said, his voice low and steady. "You are the woman who came out of a storm and mended my shirt. You asked for nothing but a place to breathe." He took a step closer. "I thought this was where you needed to be claimed. I didn't know it would be by me." She looked up at him then, her eyes glistening. The wind curled around them, sharp and sweet with pine. "I am not untouched," she whispered, the shame of the town's words clinging to her. "I am not whole," he replied simply. The snow caught in her lashes. Elias stepped forward and gently placed a hand on her shoulder. "Do you want to come home with me?" he asked. Annabeth swallowed hard, the words that had begun her journey returning to her lips, but with a new meaning. "I have nowhere else to go." "You do now," Elias said. Together, they turned from the church and walked down the steps toward the sled. Behind them, the town bell tolled, not for a wedding or a funeral, but for the quiet start of something not yet named. A soft knock came in the mid-afternoon. When Elias opened the door, he found Clara, the little orphan from town. She couldn't have been more than 7. Her eyes wet with tears and her small shoulders shaking beneath a tattered shawl. In her hands, she clutched a tin bucket that had once held salt. "Mr. Granger," she began, her voice a shy whisper. I have nowhere to go. Might I have some wood, please?" Before he could answer, Annabeth was there, a skillet of cornbread in her hand. She knelt and offered the child a warm, crumbly piece. Clara took it, her cheeks flushing with surprise. As Annabeth stood, she motioned the girl inside. Clara ducked past the threshold, setting her bucket on the floor. Elias stepped aside and pulled a bundle of kindling and a few split logs from the rack by the hearth. Clara's eyes widened. "Take this for tonight," Elias said gently. "And if you're hungry, there will be more cornbread in the morning." With a small bow far too formal for her age, the girl carefully placed the wood into her bucket and scurried away, clutching the warm bread. Annabeth closed the door, leaning against it as she let out a shaky breath. "I should have told you not to open it," she murmured. Elias reached over, brushing a stray crumb from her sleeve. He placed the empty skillet on the table. "I don't want you to handle hunger alone," he said softly. Outside, the sky softened into evening, and snow flurries began to drift. But inside the cabin, something new had settled. The feeling that a home was finally becoming possible. That night, after Annabeth was settled in her bedroll near the stove, Elias took a small wooden board and a heated poker from the fire. Into the dark grain, he burned a promise. This cabin is no longer a place of silence. He placed the board against the wall above the hearth. A tiny string-tied sprig of lavender pressed beneath it. Annabeth stirred in her sleep, but did not wake. Elias stood back, watching the letters glow in the candlelight, and said to the quiet room, "It's time for warmth again." The wind sighed through the eaves, the hearth crackled, and the cabin, once a vessel of sorrow, became a place where quiet gestures spoke louder than any words. Morning came crisp and sharp against a clean blue sky. The snow crunched under the rising sun. Annabeth was on the porch, pinning laundry to a line, her cheeks pink from the cold. Inside, Elias was sanding a length of pine, his hands sticky with resin. He whistled under his breath, a habit forgotten and newly returned. Then came the sound of hooves on frost, slow and deliberate. Annabeth looked up as a large black wagon rolled into the clearing, the kind used for supplies or cattle, or sometimes worse. It stopped with a jolt. Out stepped a man in a long tan coat, his hat too clean for these parts. He was tall and slick, with silver buckles on his boots and a ledger tucked under one arm. Roy Mercer. Annabeth's breath hitched. Her arms fell to her sides, the color draining from her face. "Roy," she whispered. He grinned as he approached. "Well, I'll be damned. You made yourself cozy." Without knocking, Roy pushed through the cabin door. Annabeth followed, frozen. Elias turned from his work, wiping his hands on a rag. His eyes narrowed. Roy held up a folded paper. "She's mine. Mail order contract. Signed and paid. The deposit's in ink, which means what you have here is property, Cowboy." Annabeth shrank back. Elias said nothing, simply letting the words hang in the air before he moved to stand between them. Roy smirked. "Hiding my goods, are you?" He shoved Elias. Elias staggered, found his footing, and swung. His fist met Roy's jaw with a dull crack. Roy stumbled back against the table, a trickle of blood blooming from his nose. Outside, a few neighbors, drawn by the noise, had gathered at the gate. They watched in silence. Roy straightened up, waving the contract. "You all see this?" he shouted. "This woman was bought, fair and legal. I came to collect what is mine." A murmur went through the small crowd. Elias wiped his knuckles on his coat and disappeared back into the cabin. A moment later, he returned. In his hand was a weathered leather pouch, the one he'd kept hidden beneath a loose floorboard, filled with 3 years of savings. He pressed it into Roy's hand. "There. That's what you paid, and more. She owes you nothing, and I owe her everything." Roy glanced inside. It was more than fair. He opened his mouth to protest, but Elias stepped closer, his voice like ice. "Leave, and the next time you put a price on a woman's life, make sure you can afford the man who loves her." Roy blinked. No one in the crowd cheered, but no one moved to his side either. Elias turned and took Annabeth's hand, raising it for all to see. "You call her mail order," he said, his voice ringing clear. "I call her a miracle. She isn't what I bought. She is who I was waiting for." Roy backed away toward his wagon, wiping his nose with a silk handkerchief. He climbed aboard, and the wagon groaned away, swallowed by the trees. In the silence that followed, an old woman stepped forward from the crowd. She handed Annabeth a piece of hard bread wrapped in linen, her eyes meeting Elias's. "Looks like someone finally bought back his soul, too," she said, before turning and walking away. Elias didn't let go of Annabeth's hand. Inside, the fire burned steady. No vows had been spoken, but something permanent had taken root, not in law or on paper, but in action. In love. Spring arrived gently in Montana, with softened soil and a wind that carried the scent of life returning. On a hill overlooking the valley, a small group gathered. There were no ribbons, no polished boots, only the earth, the sky, and the quiet of those who had come to bear witness. This was the hill where Elias had buried his father, a place he came to speak into the wind. Today, he was not alone. Annabeth stood beside him, barefoot in the damp grass. She wore a simple white dress sewn by the old widow who had given her bread, the sleeves slightly uneven. In her hands, she held a single sprig of clover. Elias wore his oldest shirt, faded at the seams, with his mother's favorite flower, a sprig of lavender, peeking from his pocket. The town preacher, a man who once scoffed at paper promises, stood before them. "I have read many vows," he said, his voice softened by time, "but I will say none today. What is happening here is not tradition. It is something older." Elias turned to Annabeth. From his pocket, he drew a cord braided from dried meadow grass, rough but strong. His hands trembled as he held it out. "Not a vow for show," he said. "A promise. In dust, in years, in the storm that brought you to me. I am yours, Annabeth, in full." Her voice was soft but clear. "I was always my own until now, and now I am yours." He tied the cord around their joined wrists. It held. The wind lifted, and a small sparrow landed on a nearby fence post. Clara, standing near the widow, clapped her hands with delight. "Look!" she cried out. "Like birds!" A gentle laughter broke the stillness, the kind that comes when a heart unclenches, when healing is no longer a hope, but a fact. After the guests left small tokens on a wooden bench, dried herbs, a cloth doll, a jar of preserves. Elias took Annabeth's hand. "There's something I need to show you." They walked to the great oak where his father's weathered cross still stood. Beneath it, Elias knelt and opened a small pine box. Inside was a single photograph of his mother, young and smiling. He placed it gently beside another, one he'd had taken without Annabeth knowing, a picture of her on the porch, with Clara on her lap, both of them laughing. He stood, looking at the two images. "Now they're both here," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "The women who gave me my life." Annabeth wrapped her arms around his waist from behind, resting her cheek against his back. "And two souls who found each other," she whispered. "Not through letters, through loss." Elias turned and kissed her brow. That night, there was no feast, only the warm glow of candlelight in the cabin. Clara played on the floor, and the scent of baking cornbread filled the home so completely that even the silence felt full. Elias sat in the chair he had carved in his loneliest years, but now it creaked with the gentle weight of two hands resting on his shoulders. The ranch no longer echoed with quiet. It sang with the sounds of morning laughter and the clink of tin cups. The eyes of a man once broken by grief now held something brighter than pain, deeper than hope. It was love. Not just found, but finally home. If this story stirred your heart, the quiet courage of Elias, the resilience of Annabeth, and a love that bloomed from pain, then more tales await on the frontier. At Wild West Love Stories, we tell stories of love that defy dust and despair, of hearts that find their way home across silence and snow. If you believe in second chances and vows made not with gold but with grit, subscribe to Wild West Love Stories, because somewhere in the wind, another heart is waiting to be found.